We tend to think of the Wild West as a place of epic duels, fearless cowboys, and non-stop action, mostly because of how Hollywood has portrayed it. But while it was definitely a challenging time, the reality was far from what we see on screen. Daily shootouts, flawless heroes, and constantly enraged Native Americans are just a few of the myths that turned into legend over time. In this video, I'm going to break down 10 misconceptions that shape the misleading image we have of the American West. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to hit the like button and stick around till the end. Now, without further ado, let's get into the story. When people think of the Wild West, they often picture dangerous gunslingers, unexpected ambushes, and skilled cowboys roaming the streets. But the truth might surprise you. Most towns were actually pretty peaceful. Some historians even argue that the Old West was more organized and safer than modern American society. Even though some areas lacked efficient local governments, private groups stepped in to resolve conflicts. They handled disputes over land, theft, and other offenses, helping maintain stability in their communities. As simple as this system was, it played a big role in keeping order, and proves that the Wild West wasn't always as wild as Hollywood makes it seem. When we hear about the Wild West, the classic image of cowboys wearing Stetson hats immediately comes to mind. But the truth is, this type of hat wasn't as common among pioneers back then. That look was mainly popularized by movies trying to create a strong visual identity for audiences. In reality, bowler and derby hats were much more popular. They fit more securely on the head, preventing the wind from blowing them off during horseback riding or outdoor work. As for the flashy white cowboy hat, no matter how stylish it looked, it could also make someone an easy target in a showdown. The OK Corral shootout is often remembered as the most famous gunfight of the Wild West, but not everyone knows what really went down that day. Despite the name making it sound like the battle happened inside or right next to the famous establishment, the actual shootout took place in an empty lot a few doors down. That small detail didn't make the event any less impactful. It took less than a minute for bullets to fly, leaving a trail of death and injuries. Even though it was over in a flash, the showdown made history and built a reputation that has lasted for generations. In Western movies, it's pretty common to see a simple card game turn into a deadly shootout. But in the real Wild West, gambling was much more than just a way to pass the time. Big tournaments attracted only the most skilled players, who were seen as true professional gamblers. Many saloons were built specifically to host these high-stakes events, where there was no room for casual players or unprepared amateurs. These places were havens for experienced gamblers, people who could read every move their opponents made and keep their cool no matter what. Being a professional gambler was a serious job, and a player's reputation was always on the line. Losing meant more than just handing over your chips. It could cost you your safety, or even your life. Winning, on the other hand, brought prestige and serious money, earning players instant fame across the region. In Western movies, most cowboys are portrayed as white men going on solo adventures. But the real history of the Wild West was much more diverse. Some reports even suggest that the famous Lone Ranger was inspired by Bass Reeves, a black U.S. Marshal whose impact was almost erased from official records. The first cowboys in the West actually came from Mexican ranchers known as vaqueros, experts in cattle driving and horseback riding. Their skills and traditions later shaped many of the practices that Hollywood made famous. It's also worth noting that crime in the Wild West wasn't just a man's game. Some women made a name for themselves as outlaws, pulling off robberies, heists, and other serious crimes. Anyone who watches Western movies might think that cowboys and Native Americans spent most of their time locked in battle. But the real history of the Wild West wasn't just about fighting. While there were certainly territorial disputes, there were also agreements, trade, and cooperation between the two sides. In many cases, Native Americans worked as guides, providing valuable services that helped settlers navigate and understand the land they were exploring. These interactions prove that their relationship wasn't just about conflict. Movies tend to focus on the violence, but there were also moments of tolerance and collaboration. When we take a closer look at the history of both groups, It's clear that their interactions were complex, filled with both hostilities and periods of coexistence that brought mutual benefits. In the Wild West, carrying a gun wasn't just a habit. It was a way to stay safe in areas where the law hadn't fully taken hold. In rural regions, people relied on firearms for self-defense and to protect their farms and livestock from wild animals. Those working in ranching, mining, or transporting goods needed protection from thieves and bandits. So keeping a gun close by just made sense. However, not every town in the West allowed people to carry weapons freely. Despite its reputation as a lawless land, some towns were stricter than you might think. Tombstone, for example, had laws banning firearms within city limits. This rule showed that even in a place often portrayed as wild and chaotic, there was an effort to establish order. Contrary to popular belief, gun ownership in the Wild West wasn't totally out of control. There were rules and consequences for those who ignored local regulations. Being a lady of the night in the Wild West wasn't exactly glamorous, but it did offer opportunities that most women of the time didn't have. The pay was good, the freedom was rare, and surprisingly, the living conditions were often comfortable. Many of these women gained levels of independence and education that few others of their era could achieve. In many places, brothel owners took their employees' safety seriously, even hiring guards to protect them. This network of support helped create a sense of security, allowing these women to live a unique lifestyle despite the risks and challenges of the Wild West. In movies, it's common to see Wild West outlaws storming into banks, guns drawn, and sacks of money slung over their shoulders. The scene usually ends with a dramatic horseback getaway, complete with gunfights and high-speed chases. This kind of story became a staple of pop culture. But if we look at historical records, bank robberies were actually pretty rare back then. It's estimated that only 3 or 4 of them happened across 15 states over a span of 4 decades. That said, when these crimes did happen, they got a lot of attention, especially when they involved outlaws who would later become legends, like the James Younger Gang, led by Jesse James and his crew. The fame of these criminals inspired countless movies and books, reinforcing the idea that bank heists were a common occurrence. But in reality, they were the exception, far from the everyday chaos that Hollywood loves to portray. A rider gallops across the American West, carrying mail to distant outposts. That's the iconic image of the Pony Express, a service that fascinated many but had a short-lived run. It lasted just 19 months, from 1860 to 1861. During that time, its riders covered routes that stretched up to 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers. They switched horses every 10 to 15 miles, 16 to 24 kilometers, and changed riders every 75 to 100 miles, 120 to 160 kilometers. While it was incredibly fast, it was also expensive. The company invested $700,000 but ended up losing around $200,000 in just over a year. A huge amount for that era. That's where I'll wrap things up. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. See you in the next story.